Welcome to Decision Analyst Insider Series webinar on design thinking for the rest of us. My name is Christy Allen. I am the Marketing Director at Decision Analyst and the moderator today. Before I introduce our presenters, I have a few notes for everyone. There is a copy of today's presentation in the handout section available for everyone to download, along with some relevant white papers and case studies. Also, please feel free to ask any questions by typing in the chat box. We will attempt to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. If we don't answer your question during the webinar, someone will respond to your question within a day or two. Today's presenters are Felicia Rogers, Executive Vice President at Decision Analyst. Felicia has worked with companies of all types and sizes to build brands, develop new products, improve marketing communications, and create satisfied customers. And Clay Detloff, Senior Vice President of Insights and Innovation, is co-presenting. He specializes in applying qualitative research and ideation techniques to help clients in their new product development efforts.
Thank you very much, Christy, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, as we talk about design thinking, we thought we'd spend the first couple of minutes introducing the topic, giving a little bit of brief history, and talking about what design thinking is and where it came from. Essentially, design thinking is a very purposeful pathway for developing something new or enhancing or refining something that already exists. And although some early versions of the approach may date back actually as far as the 1950s or 60s, the current version and term design thinking were originated about 25 years ago by the Stanford University Institute of Design, which is now dubbed the D School. It's a process for designers and innovation specialists that both guides their creation process and more importantly, or at least as importantly, keeps them grounded in the needs of the eventual users of the product or service, whether that's an architectural structure, an interior layout, maybe a durable or consumable good, or even a package design. And over the past 5 or 10 years, the process has experienced really tremendous growth in terms of awareness as well as widespread adoption far beyond the design community and into the mainstream business world. Design thinking has grown again beyond its original playing field and is now being adopted for use in all types of design initiatives. Industrial designers and engineers are using the process, or at least some parts of it, to develop new products. R&D and innovation teams are embracing design thinking as a method for quickly coming up with ideas and very rough prototypes for reactions and refinement. And also marketing teams are developing and refining products and packaging, promotional offers. So the applications are very broad and very wide at this point. The truth is, the elements of the process are not really new. But we believe the keys to design thinking's spread are really threefold. First, the steps that are being really seamlessly integrated, moving along a pathway from the beginning to end, really without lifting a pencil, so to speak. And so that's certainly the seamless integration is part of its popularity. Secondly, we feel like the focus is really very intentionally always on the end user and their needs, and that's a major key to success because this helps the development team stay grounded in what the consumer is looking for, what would benefit them, which, if it's well done, can ultimately translate into quick wins, faster wins for the developer or the company sponsoring the project, which is the third element, in fact, of design thinking's popularity. The process really often moves very quickly. So let's go ahead and get into the details and start by looking at each of these 5 modules that make up the design thinking process and how they're aligned with traditional research methods. To get us started, I'm going to ask Clay to talk to us about the empathize phase.
Thanks, and appreciate that, Felicia. Stanford defines this really first phase, if you will, or the first mode is the work you do to understand people. And it's really, honestly, it's just about understanding the lay of the land, understanding what's out there and what's going on in the world today. It's an important phase, and it probably is one of the most important phases to begin the process, and really helps ground the designer or the manager or the marketing leader, whoever's doing the research, to the needs of the end user. And that's critical to keep the end user in mind. Empathize is primarily made up of observational and conversational approaches to understanding. It's early exploration of potential audiences or markets, and really to understand the challenges, the needs, the desires, and everything that they have. It can be accomplished through casual observation and interaction. You can look at blogs, social media posts and exchanges, or so on. We were working with a client once who wanted to put a lot of bells and whistles, if you will, into a new product. And after the research, this empathize phase, what we found was what the consumers really wanted was something simple. They didn't want to be kind of burdened with a lot of bells and whistles. And so the learning from that was what we did was we actually put the bells and whistles inside, into the guts of the new product, if you will. And it was great because it made a simplified platform for the user, but it still enabled us to use, things that would leverage and differentiate that product from what was else out there right at the moment. A lot of times it's a more formalized observational research that kind of needs to be considered at this stage. To really understand what the market needs. Casual observation and social data mining can really provide part of the market view, but a lot of times ethnography or other qualitative research is essential to keep understanding what's going on with the people that we're trying to reach. A lot of times what we use is multi-methods. Every methodology, especially in qualitative, has, unique strengths and weaknesses. And so a lot of times what we will do at this phase is really do a combination of methods, whether it's a bulletin board type of methodology or an ethnography, virtual ethnography, and a focus group. So it's really kind of putting together a research plan and a research form that will give you the answers that you need. To truly comprehend, we need to go what's beyond observable. And so it's key to really kind of often do things with an ethnographic approach as well as an approach where we're just doing deep dives and probes. And it's key that we really try to understand what's going on in their minds and in their behaviors. And I'll turn it back over to you, Felicia.
Great. So once all of that is done, then we move into the define stage, which Stanford refers to as bringing clarity and focus based on what you've learned to craft a meaningful and actionable problem statement. Basically, here's where, as the term suggests, we're really defining what the problem is and what need is going to be met through the rest of the process in the development stages. So in other words, it's a very analytical step, and it results in a well-defined and well-understood and articulated need. Everything we can see in the observations that we conduct and everything else that we're able to kind of unearth through those sophisticated qualitative research techniques and analytical steps that Clay was describing in the empathize stage, it really begins to come together here in this stage. Really deep and critical thinking, which does admittedly take time, can't be done just super quickly all the time. We've got to take time to think deeply and critically to understand both what we saw and what we heard, as well as what we didn't see or hear, to help us really formulate our understanding of the need that's out there. So once we've carefully considered all of this, we can synthesize the learning and form a very focused problem statement. This sometimes is an aha moment, if you will. And as we arrive at the specific problem we're trying to solve, again, that really guides us into all of the following steps that are going to be taken. So the define step helps give us structure and definition to the challenge or the problem that we are, again, to get us ready to move into the next stages where we'll begin to develop a solution to that problem. which actually leads us into the third stage, which is ideation. And I'm going to turn it back to Clay here to talk about this phase.
Thank you. And I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to say ideate than it is to say empathize. That's a tongue twister for me.
Especially this time in the middle of the day.
That's true. Now that we know kind of what's been defined, and really it's about telling us what sandbox we're going to be trying to play in, we then start digging around and understanding what's in that sandbox and what we can do inside of it. Going back to Stanford again, it refers to this as kind of concentrating on idea generation, going wide in terms of concepts and outcomes. And I think this is really a lot of where the fun is, if you will. This is a time to really kind of blow things outside, think outside the box, and really just kind of come up with a lot of different ideas and a lot of different concepts. A couple of criteria are essential for success in this mode of ideation. First, we really have to define the boundaries. And we talk a lot about as being boundaries or bumpers or borders or guardrails. But the idea is that there needs to be some kind of a focus. So wide open, blue sky thinking is really creative and in some places needed, and it's the right thing to do. But really, we have to remember that there is a business purpose, if you will, and that we need to develop practical solutions, and we need to be focused. And so we set these boundaries or bumpers to really understand and to make sure that we're attacking the issue that we need to attack. Sometimes these boundaries or bumpers could be as simple as we need a new name for a product. We need to be able to, put some kind of a name to something that's existing and to make it better. Sometimes it is blue sky. We've recently done a project where we were talking to first-time mothers, and the whole idea was to understand what the issues surrounding being a first-time mother were and ideate with new products, services, and all kinds of things. There was no really boundary as far as what could be developed, as long as it was any kind of a product or service that would help these new mothers in the course of their being a new mother, if you will. Second really piece of that is we have to keep an open mind, and no ideas are bad ideas at this point. Everything that fits within the established guardrails is on the table. We may even push the boundaries just a bit because we want to develop a lot of starter ideas that'll, be able to help us get the best solution. There's no judgment, and we got to make sure that we set these sessions up to take away any kind of judgment, real or perceived, that could be brought into a session. Though feasibility discussions are going to be coming later, right now it's really about just pushing as hard and fast as we can and getting all of the possibilities. One of the things that we have here is a group we call the Imaginators, which is a creative consumer panel, if you will. And we found that this group is very effective at coming up with these new ideas. A lot of times what we found is typical consumers are really good at kind of tweaking things. They can kind of tell you what they like and they don't like, but kind of truly out of the box thinking, sometimes there's a difficulty there. So with these Imaginators, these creative consumers, we've really found a lot of success in making sure that we're thinking outside the box. As always in ideation, the first part is the brainstorming. Let's get as many ideas as you can. And the second part is really kind of winnowing those down. And so, once we've satisfied that we've got the ideas and the idea fragments that we need, then we have to winnow it down. We have to kind of narrow the focus. So now's the time where that feasibility discussion comes in, at least at a high level. Which ideas make sense from a business perspective and which ones don't. There are a number of questions to be asked at this point, and they can vary really depending on the product or the category. The goal is to take a moderate number of ideas into the next stage, where we'll really begin to kind of gather end user input and refinement. And one thing about this too is this winnowing stage is not just picking the best of what was there, but it's really kind of tweaking and refining some of those ideas at the same time. And so it's building upon others' ideas as part of this process.
And so that moves us then into the stage that's actually called prototype. And here is where traditional processes, in a way, can sometimes be flipped upside down. Stanford makes a case that here at this in this mode, we're building to think rather than thinking and then building. So rather than carefully planning to build prototypes, this stage is often made up of very rough early mock-ups or depictions of a product, an idea that are physically built, or maybe they're sketched, kind of as in a think-as-you-go manner. And that's done in order to continue the development process, the tweaking process, and to demonstrate what the product could be like and to communicate to potential end users and other constituents, again, what it might be like, what it could be like, how could we make it better. And so lots of fast-moving actions are taking place here. We're often working with things like line drawings or paper or foam renderings, sometimes 3D printing. But think about a paper airplane, which I think is a great example. It's a very, very simple depiction of a product that's extremely intricate and high-tech. But that's the type of thing we're doing here in this prototype stage. So they're usually created often very quickly, but they're created to provide stimulus for discussion and interaction. A sketch artist or a product designer typically is doing this on the fly again as we work in often a workshop type session. And again, the purpose here is to refine and get further feedback and to just sort of keep the process moving forward. Again, as Clay mentioned, we're often involving consumers here who have really creative minds. They're very innovative thinkers, like our Imaginators community. We often are also bringing together other people, whether they're stakeholders from a company or members of the community in one role or another. And bringing these people together is a very effective way to, again, kind of bring a group of people together to build on each other's ideas and push further and further. And at this step, the learning is quick and iterative. So here's where the term that a lot of people are using, fail fast, I'll put that in air quotes, often comes into play because, again, it's communicating that these are rough ideas, they're built out very rapidly, they're being done inexpensively so that we can learn what we need and keep moving. And this stage often contributes to the winnowing process that Clay was talking about before, and it helps drive the team a lot closer to what the eventual concept or final product will actually look like. So once this stage is complete and we've really gotten to a formal prototype, we're ready to get into a more formal testing stage. And in this test mode, which Stanford, by the way, refers to as soliciting feedback about the prototypes you have created from your users, and have another opportunity to gain empathy for the people you're designing for. That kind of takes us back to the beginning of this discussion where we talked about that focus on the end user and how critical that really is and how it's one of the keys of success to design thinking. So more formal testing of a small number of prototypes is taking place at this stage. That's always in order before moving into a production phase with any kind of a product or service. So in order to evaluate the product's chances for success, we need a feedback mechanism. We need some feedback from people who will eventually use it. And ideally, what we're doing here is testing a very realistic, a usable prototype that's been developed for those end users to experience and evaluate and give their impressions of it, tell us about how well it worked or didn't work. We're looking for suggestions for improvement. We're just really trying to understand their experience. And so we also, at this stage, if we are far enough along in the development process, want to know about their interest in the product, and get their various perceptions. Ultimately, we need to know how likely are they to buy it or to use the service. So we want to understand those advantages and disadvantages. How can we tweak it? What are the needs moving forward? And in terms of a setting for this type of testing, it depends very much on the product itself. Is it something that I'll put, again, in air quotes, kind of a simple product, or is it really intricate and complex to build? Is it expensive to build the prototype, or is it something that's relatively inexpensive to do, and so therefore we could produce hundreds of them if that's in order? And so whenever it's feasible, the test really ought to take place in a real-world usage setting. So if it's a product that is used in people's homes, we want to produce hundreds of them or some relatively large number of them and send them to their homes so they can use them as they would every day with their families or, as they're getting ready for work in the morning, whatever the case may be. We want it to be real world.
And can I just jump in here? I mean, I think that's such an important piece, that real world aspect. Being in the real world does two things. One, it lets you understand any social impacts that are out there. And the second one is it really helps you understand any environmental impacts that are out there. We were working with a client once on a product that was going to be used in the kitchen area. And we developed the prototype, brought it into in-home use to take a look at. And what we found was that the product didn't fit very well in the kitchen storage cabinets. And so, great product, but it just was a size matter for what was typically out there in the consumer's home. So again, really that in-home use or just understanding that actual environment really is a good key.
That's a great example, because if we were testing it in a central location, which I'll talk more about in a minute, consumers wouldn't be having it on their own kitchen counters or in their own cabinets, so they wouldn't have that environmental perspective that you're talking about. On the other hand, though, sometimes it is not practical to test things in people's homes or in those real-world settings. Perhaps it's a very large or a very expensive prototype to produce. And so in those cases, we often do look to a central location test facility where we can bring in, for example, a large home appliance or an automobile or something that has that kind of a scale to it. And in that location, then we can recruit people to come into that setting and use the product, test it out, take a look at all the details. Again, give us the same types of pros and cons that they might have been able to do with a small product in their homes, but it's just that the setting is different here. Regardless of the location, though, the objective is really the same. We're looking to evaluate the product idea or the prototype. We need to understand more about the end user's needs and their desires and their reactions to this new product. And again, most importantly, how can it be improved before we move into the next stage, which oftentimes is going right into production. So the obvious question, I guess, at this point is, what does this process really look like in action? We've broken it down into stages, but as we put it into context, what does this look like? So honestly, the research, the types of research that are aligned with each of these steps may sound very familiar, but here's our thinking on how we characterize each step. So as we take a look at the first stage, empathize, remember that what we're doing here is we're looking to make discoveries about the potential end user and the audience. This often takes the form of various types of qualitative research, as Clay talked about a few minutes ago. It can be in person, it can be online, it can be combinations where that makes the most sense. But we're often using some form of in-depth or in-the-moment technique. We want to, again, understand what it is that the consumer or the end user is doing in their everyday life, and what do they need? What kind of unmet needs are there that we can address with our new product? And so often, again, there's a blended approach that we use to uncover all the issues. Again, the ones that are obvious and that are stated, and the ones that are somewhere under the surface where we can observe and kind of pull that learning together. The next stage of define is where we're synthesizing all that we've learned in that first exploratory stage. And so here we're pulling together what are those needs and desires that we want to address. So a very thorough analysis of this past research or recent research is in order. We're considering what we're seeing in the unstructured data, perhaps, that we were able to gather through social media posts and other types of online forums, or maybe other customer service feedback data, just all kinds of unstructured data comes together. And the learning from the formal observations and other types of qualitative research. And that ultimately then leads us to that defined direction or that problem statement that needs to be addressed, which then is where we come to the ideation phase. So now, as Clay mentioned earlier, we've got the guardrails, we've got the bumpers, we know where we're going, and we need to gather the right people to generate ideas. This often includes a cross-functional team of stakeholders or project owners from the company that's sponsoring the project. And again, at Decision Analysts, we often tap into our Imaginators community, but they're usually one small piece of the pie or of the puzzle. The idea is to bring together the right people in the right place, in the right amount of time that will help us spark the right ideas and help develop probably hundreds of those starter ideas or idea fragments that can then be taken into the next stages. And once this ideation is complete, again, we go into that winnowing process to kind of pull back and make sure that we've got the focus narrowed down and really pointed in the right direction to get us moving into that prototype phase. And here's where the real hands-on work takes place. This is often the fastest moving part. Prototyping can certainly be done in design labs, at the home office, but with design thinking, the work is really typically very rough and fast moving. And so oftentimes it's done in a workshop type setting, which is multiple hours or maybe even a couple of days, 2 or 3 days long. And we're bringing all these stakeholders together and these creative individuals together to co-create. It's a setting that frankly works best when it's not on site with our client team. We're off somewhere where the environment fosters creativity and takes us away from our desk and our email to really get the creative juices moving. But again, here we're doing rough mock-ups, very quickly created so that we can get reactions from consumers and from other stakeholders, keep the process moving very quickly, make some changes, come back and look at the next round of prototypes and so on. Again, very iterative and very quick moving process. And ultimately here at the end of this stage, we're identifying one or a few kind of final designs that'll be tweaked, get some updates for final prototyping, and then into the testing stage, where finally we've got a fully fleshed out concept or prototypes that can go in for more rigorous testing like we were just talking about a moment ago. And depending on that stimulus, again, we can either be in homes or we can be in a central location testing facility. We would bring in a system like Decision Analyst has a concept test or even an Optima product testing system. Many systems are out there with firms like ours. But the idea is to make sure that we've got some type of formalized testing system in place where we can measure, how promising is this new product? Is it something that looks like the end user is going to embrace and adopt and want to buy? And also diagnostics come into play where we're trying to figure out, we're at the prototype stage. So what are some of the final tweaks that need to be made to really improve its chances for success?
Great. And one of the things I love about this is it's really a framework for thinking. And so each of these steps is there, and it's make sure that you kind of understand the whole process. Interestingly, though, we have some clients that come in and they have more of a research and development tilt to them. And so more internally, their focus is kind of this ideation and this prototype development. And when we kind of come across and work with these types of clients, we also want to make sure, though, that they kind of go back to the empathize and to the define stage to make sure that these products and services that are being developed are consumer relevant and still have a place in that consumer's needs and wants. So it's a great thing to think about the whole process in its whole fruition, if you will, so that you can kind of make sure, we are very central or very concentrated on ideation prototype. Let's make sure that we don't forget that consumer input at the beginning.
Exactly. And that's one of those keys to this philosophy of design thinking is making sure you're always focused on the end user and meeting their needs so that you've got better chances for success. So a question you might be asking at this point is, how long does this whole process take? There's a lot that we're talking about, and it sounds like it could take a long time. We're going to go through a couple of timeline examples here, and they're really meant to be kind of on the extreme ends of the way a schedule might look. So, Clay, do you want to walk us through the first example, and then I'll take the next one?
Yeah, that'd be great. So this first one it's the long version, if you will. And so, it could take better part of a year, and honestly, or, depending on the product and category, could be 2 or 3 year endeavor or even longer as you go through this. In the first example, though, we're looking at, you can see there's kind of a thorough exploration using qualitative research and observations. That's going to be conducted in the empathize mode. We'd review all the relevant past research and dive broadly and deeply into the social and other online content. And I think, importantly in this, we're not talking only doing primary research, but we're looking at secondary research too. There are past work that's been done within our clients, past new products that had been developed and maybe scrapped, as well as kind of, again, the social media aspect. But it's looking at everything that you have availability to look at to really understand what's going on. The process can take up to a few months to execute it if needed. Then we kind of go to that define step. So we've done our research, primary, secondary. We synthesize the learning. Maybe we do several stakeholders involved in the process to make sure that we're getting all the input that we need. This could take a week or more. Then you go into this ideation area, and ideation, it can be done through traditional means, could include multiple sessions with multiple groups of stakeholders. And the goal would be that you would have some detailed concepts developed as final output from these sessions. Again, let's just kind of throw a number out of 4 weeks for there. Then the prototyping comes. The prototyping is then up to the engineers, the designers, or whoever is responsible for that. That process is going to depend a lot on the product category and the complexity. But let's say on average it takes 4 to 6 weeks to complete. Then you take the prototype testing phase. It could include additional qualitative reactions and discussions. Again, in this tweaking process that you could go through, there could be some prototype refinements. Then you go in with a robust product test. And again, as we talked about it, as Felicia mentioned, it could be either done in a central location. It could be done in homes. It could be done in the workplace, wherever it is relevant to do that, and you can see the results and can see the actions and behaviors. This could take an additional 8 to 10 weeks to kind of go through everything. So if you think about it, this whole process kind of in this elongated aspect could take 8 or 9 months, or even longer, depending on the product or category.
And so you may be thinking, I don't have 8 or 9 months to do this whole process. The good news is, in the second example here, we've shortened up several of the steps quite a bit. And certainly there are trade-offs in taking some of the time out of the schedule. But the truth is, we don't always need to go with a long, drawn-out timeline and do every single step, that thoroughly. So in this second example, again, several of the steps are shortened. And so it starts, of course, it goes through all the steps that we've been talking about, and Clay described many of them in detail. But the first step here, again, is a review of relevant past research. And what we're not doing in this particular example is any new primary research. So we're really focused on past research. Maybe a brief qualitative step could be included, but maybe you've got plenty of research that you've already done recently or in the relatively recent past. We can do some social media monitoring and things like that, and we can streamline this empathize stage down to a matter of a few weeks, maybe even less, depending on what's already available and what we already know. Then the second piece is the define stage, of course, and here, I think it's easier to get to a definition when, frankly, there's a smaller team of people involved. So if we know what we learned in the empathize phase, we can kind of contain the discussions and the decision-making process and really get to a pinpointed problem, oftentimes within a day or two or three, to kind of keep us really moving through the process. Then in the ideate phase, what we're doing here, as opposed to the more traditional several week long process and maybe multiple pieces of the puzzle, we are able to do, and folks are able to do, an ideation workshop over the course of just a couple of days. Now, this is a highly compressed type of approach, but it can be very successful as long as everybody who's participating is really bought into the process and really committed to spending the time. This is almost always done off-site. You don't want to be in your office doing this sort of thing because it almost ends up being an around-the-clock process. For example, on day one, we might bring folks together and work through the knowledge that we already have and start doing some of this iterative ideating, coming up with lots of ideas. You can almost even combine it with the prototype phase, in that where we may be starting to build out some ideas in this phase, those paper airplane types of ideas. And then at the end of the day, we've got new ideas or ideas for how to tweak the things that we've come up with today. And the lucky folks who are on the industrial design team or the engineers spend several hours overnight, honestly, kind of remaking, reformulating the plans, or maybe they're concept writers who are revising the concepts overnight. We come back on day two, kind of go through the whole process over again. This is a really compressed way, a very efficient way to do ideation and some of the prototyping as well, and get that down into a much shorter time frame. Of course, if you have to go into prototyping that's more highly technical, then again, we're back to the design team and the engineers, who certainly are going to need a number of weeks in most cases to create working prototypes that can go into the testing phase. And then in the testing phase, a way to shorten that process would be to perhaps not do any qualitative early reactions, but to just go right to that rigorous testing. And again, whether it's in-home testing or central location testing, this process can be refined and made a little bit more efficient, brought down to 4 to 6 weeks, maybe even faster than that, depending on what we're doing, where we're doing, how we're doing it. Again, just trying to bring this into a much more focused timeline. So that shorter example that we just described, as you can see, 12, 15 weeks, something like that. So really from beginning to end, we're talking more like a few months instead of 8 or 9 months. And, a lot of companies will have more of an appetite for that type of a timeline than the longer one. But it depends very much on the product that we're developing and what the requirements are. So with all of that being said, we're about to wrap this up by just really reminding everyone that today, companies and lots of organizations are embracing the design thinking philosophy. It's being talked about a lot in business circles, at conferences, and really for good reason. It's very productive, and companies are finding success with this. But there are a handful of keys to being successful, and just as a reminder here, those primary ones are making people the main focus. That's really the main key to success. We want to focus on the end user. We want to make sure that we're serving those people well, meeting their needs, filling in any gaps that may exist for them. And so the question is, what do they need? And what do they want? And those are really the things that we need to make sure we're addressing. Ultimately, how can we improve their lives in some way? Honestly, the success of any new product or service is completely dependent on whether or not we're meeting the needs of a customer base. Are they going to embrace the new product? Or is it going to be something that it doesn't really capture their attention? So if it does meet their needs, provide value for them, enhance their lives in some way, we can feel confident that we very likely have a success on our hands. And with that, we're going to open it up to see if we've got any questions that have come up as we've been talking.
Okay. Yeah. Felicia, first question I have actually is, can you share the Stanford research you're referencing? Can you
Sure.
talk a little bit more about that, maybe?
To be completely honest, what we've gone through here is really the pathway that Stanford has published, and we've kind of adapted it and talked about it in terms of how does traditional research fit into these methods. But it is something that I should have brought into the room with us here, but it can be easily Googled. There's a lot of literature that's been published by Stanford. I think if you Google design thinking, you'll be able to pull that up pretty quickly. And if we know who this question came from, we could follow up afterwards also and give you some information by email.
Fantastic. Next question is, actually I'm going to put two questions together. The process can be quite long. If you're pressed for time, where should your attention be focused? And kind of along with that is, do you have to go through all 5 steps of the process to be successful?
Good question. And that kind of gets to that timeline issue that we sort of wrapped up with. The process can be long for sure. And if we're pressed for time, I'm going to go back to that slide that lays out the timelines. If we're pressed for time, apologies, I'm skipping slides here. I would say we really, really need to focus on the empathize phase. Not that we can skip the others, but empathize is so critical. And I think Clay and I both spoke to this to some extent. We've got to understand the audience and what their needs are. What are we really trying to do? And what we're trying to do is meet the need of a potential customer. So if we spend enough time understanding, the life of that customer, what are their daily routines like? What are their work habits like? And really getting to know them, not only through primary research, but perhaps by, finding blogs that are pertinent to this audience and things like that. That's where we really can't skimp. We've got to make sure we understand the empathize process. And then, defining the problem can be very quick. Ideating is very important, because if we go too fast through the ideation process, we're going to miss some ideas that may have bubbled up, even if it's over the course of a couple of days. But certainly if we're able to give it a couple of weeks or more, ideas will come up, and then we can build on those ideas. And I would say that's another really important step in the process, to make sure that we capture all the possibilities for ways of addressing that problem. So new product ideas, new concept ideas, and then rigorous testing at the end is, of course, important. Hopefully that answers that question.
Very good. Yeah, and I'll just throw in, along with that kind of the empathize phase and kind of understanding the research, there's a lot of times what we find is the clients, they already have a lot of information existing too. So there's a lot of internal knowledge, maybe from past research, or just internal knowledge from people who have been in the company organization for 10, 20, 30 years, that are really able to help and kind of quicken that pace as you go through. Yeah,
and we've definitely seen that with some projects that kind of follow this flow, or at least touch on it, is that exactly to your point, Clay, there is knowledge usually inside a company. It never hurts to get back out there in the market and make sure we have our finger on the pulse of what's happening today. But that traditional knowledge is almost always on target, and can provide a great platform for sort of a jumping off point as you get started.
Okay.
Looks like we have another question about any examples or case studies using this process. I think one way to address that is that, kind of in answering some of the other questions and touching on the timelines, oftentimes what happens is we do some of these steps, but not all of them, or we don't do them as a real step-by-step process exactly as it's laid out. But there certainly are a number of areas where we've helped our clients, understand what the problem is, really pinpoint what it is that needs to be addressed in the marketplace, and then spend a lot of time in the ideation phase. We've mentioned our Imaginators. That's a fair amount of business that we do within Clay's group, as a matter of fact, ideation and qualitative together. So honestly, we can't really share any specific cases right now, but we've worked in multiple categories, including durable goods, including package design. We've done some really fun package design work that was actually on that shorter timeline with a 2 or 3 day workshop that was extremely productive, and it's a very recent one, so it's out in test market right now. And
one of the things that, again, not getting too specific, but we did a study not too long ago in the financial services industry. And it was really interesting in the empathize phase. Literally what we did was we did a series of ethnographies as well as deep dive interviews. In the financial industry, you got to do a deep dive interview just because you can't do anything in a group as personal as it needs to be. But what we did was everything that we were trying to gain was on negatives or barriers of what was existing out there in the world and the marketplace today. And so the whole focus was, everything from banking to credit cards to debit cards to 401ks. Everything was a negative focus. I hate to say negative focus, but we were really looking to understand what was wrong with what was out there. And that was a great way to then kind of look at the defining aspect, to get all that information together, find where the holes were, which is really kind of what the definition was, and then the ideation was to design to kind of move from there and say, okay, here's the hole. What kind of products or services, thinking outside the box across all financial types of transactions and institutions, could be developed to fill those holes. And then again, a prototype and test was done after that. But that was an example of kind of starting something throughout the whole phase. But interestingly enough, really focusing on the negatives at that empathize phase. Mm-hmm. I think we have time maybe for one more question. As you work with various companies, what are the roles of the people heading up projects like this? Are they in innovation roles or marketing or something else?
That's a great question. I think the answer is yes. We have worked with companies where our contacts were in, various roles. Sometimes we are working even with marketing researchers who are leading the charge on a project and seeing it all the way through. Oftentimes it does fall into an innovation group or someone who's in charge of new ideas. That would be innovation, clearly. Sometimes we're working with R&D, like Clay mentioned earlier. It can be really that more scientific and engineering focused group. So it's not always coming from one place within an organization. In fact, there may be times where we could be working on multiple products with the same client company, but coming at it from different parts of the organization. So maybe an innovation team or an R&D team has one thing going on, and the marketing team's got something different going on. Great question.
Good. And just kind of as a quick, hopefully a quick response, and we can go more in depth as we move forward or after the sessions are over. But these can be done, in a week. You can kind of streamline it, go through it very quickly. It's a little bit different. You may not be getting all of the information that you need at each of those stages. But I think, as Felicia mentioned, we've done a project where the idea of the prototype, the concept testing was done in about a 3-day period. The testing, I will say this, probably the first 4 stages can be done in a very concentrated time frame, depending on what you actually want to test and what that kind of product or service is. Mm-hmm. That testing phase may be elongated if you have to finalize it, if you have to, kind of put some kind of production into it. But those first 4 phases could be done very quickly, especially if you have internal knowledge, existing understanding of what's going on, or if you can do a very quick hit on some primary research.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said. Things can be done quickly or, can take a longer time period if we're really going with systematic and rigorous testing and working through each phase. I do think that we are about at the end of our time, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Christy, our host today, to wrap things up for us.
Thank you, Clay and Felicia, and thank you everyone for attending today's Insider Series webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to email Clay or Felicia. This is our final Insider Series webinar for 2017. Be sure to keep a lookout for our webinar series for next year starting in February. In the meantime, please feel free to visit our website to view our past webinars on topics from qualitative research and innovation to sales forecasting and media mix modeling. And have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.